Hello, everyone. We'll just be getting started shortly. Hello there. We'll be getting started in just a moment. Hello to everyone joining. We'll be getting started in just a moment. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, Cybersecurity, the Board Report 1 year on. Shortly, I'll be handing over to James Arthur, Partner and Head of Cyber Consulting at Grant Thornton. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders. You can use the polls function to the right of your viewing pane to ask questions. If you haven't already, you can click the theatre mode button under your viewing pane to watch in full screen. James, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for having me on today. As Mark said, I'm a partner at Grant Thornton. I head up the cyber consulting team there. I've been with the firm about 2.5 years now, but I've been working in the field of cyber for about just over 20 years now, and seen it change quite a lot during that time. So I was asked today to talk a little bit about the board report 1 year on. And so I thought to make sense of that, I better explain a little bit about what the board report was. So the board report was something that we published at Grant Thornton in 2019. It was the results really of a set of surveys we've done with the C-suite and boards at a number of mid-market clients. Now, Grant Thornton, the definition of mid-market is quite broad. So we class that of companies that have turnovers between 15 million and 1 billion per annum, which clearly gives quite a large latitude as to the types of companies we talk to and their individual sizes. So we interviewed about 300 of these firms to talk to them about how their board approached cybersecurity, whether they were taking it seriously, whether they'd seen the effects of various attacks, and how they were thinking about it at the board level. So as a result of that, I think one of the most interesting statistics we'd come across was that of those just over 300 firms that we talked to, over 73% of them had responded, say that they had had a cyber attack and they'd suffered up to 25% loss. I'll go on to it in a next slide about what the distribution of that was. But it was interesting for us to see the statistics that we all see a lot in cybersecurity press about the prevalence of attacks nowadays, to see that really borne through in those organisations we were talking to. So it was really about playing back what we'd heard from the market, but also trying to give some recommendations and guidance around how people could start to look at improving their cybersecurity, starting from the board level down. But this isn't, it definitely wasn't a technology push or a software push, because we firmly believe that a lot of cybersecurity can be improved through some fairly straightforward actions that don't need to cost a huge amount of money. So in terms of the findings that we'd had and looking at the summary of the up to 25% loss, what was interesting, so the two statistics you can see on the screen there, the size of the impact of the cyber attack in terms of annual revenue, and the impact of the cyber attack that they looked at. So although the headline said up to 25%, there was really only up the upper tier of the 6% of respondees. Actually, just over a quarter had no financial impact of the cyber attack. So that might have been where a non-business critical system was hit, or where people managed to respond quickly enough. So there was a distribution, but even for most of the firms that we were looking at, anywhere and from the sort of 3 to 5% of revenue and above, was an uncomfortable moment for them. And it's not just around the financial costs, as we saw in figure 3 there. People were worried about the reputational damage, the cleanup costs and the management time. And the more and more clients that we talk to with our incident response team and others, that's where an increasing amount of focus is going. The actual management time, the distraction from running the business that people have to go through when they actually have a cyber attack or data breach on their organization. What was also interesting was the amount of awareness out there about the cyber threat, and this is something that we've seen really continuing over the last year or year and a half. We spent an awful lot of time talking to boards and businesses and trying to explain to them the evolving nature of cyber. I think there's an awful lot of C-suite individuals who still think of the stereotypical sort of Hollywood hacker, people wearing hoodies, sitting in dark basements, and deciding to attack individual companies because they want something specific from that company. Now, we're not saying that there aren't those types of people out there, and there are, the advanced persistent threats and nation states, but for most of the mid-market, they don't really make it on those targeting radars. What they do suffer from is the volume cybercrime effect. So people who are just looking for vulnerabilities and will attack people irrespective of who they are. And so some simple and very straightforward and basic measures that we've all known sort of come to implement in our sort of private lives as well as our public lives about just simple things like multi-factor authentication. There are still a lot of mid-market firms out there who haven't implemented this. So we asked them about the figure 6, did they think any of their login details were available online? There was a huge amount, just over half, either strongly agreed or slightly agreed. Whereas I think most of us who've been in the industry a while know that these things are coming out all the time. So if you look in the press, the SIT 0-day credential leak that just came out, that was another 218 million unique credential pairs that hadn't been seen before. So there are a lot of easy ways that people can be attacked and easy things that they can do about it. And what was also interesting was, despite all of the drive around trying to get boards to look at cybersecurity, in the just over 300 that we surveyed, only 37.3 said that their boards regularly met to review cybersecurity risk and management. So there was still a huge amount of emphasis within boards of thinking as an IT problem and pushing it out to IT. What was also interesting, and see on the right of the slide there on the figure 9, so a lot of large organizations can afford to have their own chief information security officers. We found in mid-market that was rarely the case. There's quite a wide distribution of who actually on the board owned the cyber risk, where they actually had a board member responsible. So the CIOs and CTOs, not hugely surprising, but a lot were, and again, a lot of clients we're talking to now, it's the CFOs, it's those financial officers who are taking the responsibility for risk, where organizations are starting to see the cyber should be managed as just another business risk. So there is a lot of emphasis out there, and it's not just us doing research on it. There's lots of people talking about how boards should take cybersecurity more importantly. The NCSC, so the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, again, are having quite a large push on this, and have been for a while. So they've launched the NCSC board toolkit. Now it can be quite a big document. It's about 50 pages in it, but they're at pains to point out it's not for people to run through every single page. But it is to try and start to set the questions that boards can ask of themselves and ask of their companies to understand where it is. And again, there are some high-level ways to work through this, but equally, there is quite a lot of detail in there. But again, what is, I think, surprising for quite a few people who work in the industry, despite all the statistics out there and the headlines about cyber attacks and the news about it, boards are still seem to be being relatively slow about implementing cyber at board level and understanding it and moving through the risk. And as we all know, the world's changed an awful lot over the last year. I won't dwell on it for too long, but this may have been covered in some of the earlier sessions. There has been a huge rise in cybercrime, especially the volume cybercrime over the last year. We've seen a lot of businesses accelerate their digital journeys, with more staff working online, trying to have more ways to engage with their clients offline. So we've had to have business having to readily adapt. And the other interesting thing, of course, and that rise in volume cybercrime, again, there's been some interesting research around various organised crime groups who maybe had been dabbling in cyber before, putting a lot more emphasis behind that as other revenue streams dry up. So there's been got more people working more remotely. We've got more people who are looking to attack, not necessarily individual technical experts, but looking at using the different methods of intrusion and attack that you can buy off the web. So the NCSE had a really interesting saying, I think it was 2 years ago, that anybody can be or can hire a cyber criminal. So it doesn't necessarily need that deep level of expertise. And again, the number of attacks is going up, both phishing, ransomware, and malware being designed around COVID-19. So the world has got, if anything, slightly more dangerous in terms of cyber. And as I said, we've seen a lot of organisations accelerate those digital transformations. And this can be an area where certainly a number of clients we've worked with, where assumptions can come in, which can prove to be quite damaging if not addressed properly. So the old idea of a company having its own enclosed network and having the only thing it used is pretty outdated now. Most of us are using some form of staff remote access. An awful lot of mid-market clients will have remote or outsourced IT providers, people supporting their systems. They might be using cloud environments. Clients will be interacting, payment providers and suppliers. So there's an awful lot of overlap now between what traditionally we thought of as individual organisation systems and their wider ecosystem. And as people have rushed to get things in place, what we've seen is either not enough time spent designing the security or checking the security around those interactions, but also often at a policy and commercial level. So in lots of organisations we've been working with, any two sides of the diagram there have both assumed that the other party is taking care of their cybersecurity requirements without necessarily noting it down. So we've had to spend almost as much time on technical details as we have on looking over people's contracts and commercials to make sure that actually the risk is being well understood and articulated and shared, as opposed to just making those assumptions. So as I talked about 1 year on, so a number of attacks are increasing. The number of boards that are taking or reviewing cyber on a regular basis has increased slightly, but we haven't seen a real step change in that yet. What we do see quite a lot is when we're talking to non-executive directors and board members, they say they would like to better understand the cyber risk, but can sometimes feel exposed when they admit that, especially in smaller companies. So that again tends to contribute to them just thinking they can outsource it to IT or outsource it to their IT provider, even if they haven't been able to check whether they have the right set of requirements in there. As I said, lots of boards still don't review their cyber risk regularity, and again trying to get this understanding. And I think that the world of cyber can get a bad reputation at times for scaremongering and talking about the sort of volume cybercrime. It's not supposed to be a scare tactic. It's just a reflection of the reality. There's some very interesting research done last year that concluded that cybercrime is now the most profitable type of crime you can get involved in. So for the first time, it became more profitable than things like the traditional drugs area. Now, and the thing about cybercrime is if you do it across international boundaries, actually the risks of getting detected are fairly low, and the risks of being incarcerated are very low, as opposed to normal crime. So again, it's not supposed to be a scare story. It's just what the new normal is. And so trying to get the attention of boards around cyber to take them from the understanding of, yes, there are a lot of statistics out there that people are being hit, through to why should it really matter to them, beyond just knowing that a close competitor or somebody they knew has been suffered a cyber attack, or that organisation themselves, which will always get people interested. I'm not sure we've had a client yet who's been through an incident who hasn't then started to review their cyber risk on a regular basis. So trying to get the attention of the board. So we've tried various methods over the last year. We've talked to a number of different companies who've been looking at various different ways to do this. And the most effective that we have found thus far, outside of people either being hit themselves, as we said, or knowing somebody's been hit, is really to try and continue that journey of translating cyber risk into business risk, and specifically into financial risk, especially where it is the CEO or the FD who is looking at and having responsibility around that area. And so if you're translating into financial risk, and this is something that people have been trying to do for a while in various different guises, I think it's very important to make it specific to that organisation that you're talking to, and using real world data. So this is something that the cyber insurance ecosystem has been looking at for some time, to really try and understand both what is the sort of empirical chance of somebody being targeted from that volume cyber attack channel that I've talked about before, plus what are the real world costs that they've actually implemented. As if you'll remember from the second slide in, there was quite a wide range of distribution of costs from a successful cyber attack or data breach, even from mid-market firms. So spending time with a company to understand what their business is, what their core systems are, what the cost of business interruption really would be if different systems were affected, understanding their data holdings, understanding how they do business, if their business is built around intellectual property, how is that stored, how is that protected, and how much of their revenue is based on that. So really understanding the business and the business impact that could come around from any type of outage, be that from cyber attack or any other source. And then marrying that with an understanding of what are the technical controls that they have in place. Now, the nice thing about this is you don't need to involve the board in understanding their technical controls. That typically is, interviews with the IT staff or the outsourced IT provider. But to get a really good understanding of which of the either the NIST or the CIS top 20 or some various other standards that you've got available, to understand what's been implemented at the minute, so that these two factors can be taken and fed into a model that's informed by sort of cyber insurance underwriters, but also those real world costs of a cyber attack. Now, putting those two things together allows us to project to the board to say, for the next 12 months, what would be their anticipated cyber loss in a number of different attack vectors with their current controls, and what would be their worst case loss. And turning it into that sort of pounds, shillings and pence really allows boards to look at it objectively and understand what's the level of current risk and what is their level of exposure, and then do some modelling around, well, actually, if we invested in a specific control, what would that do? And that allows it to be taken and considered much more alongside other sort of really far-reaching business risks to those organisations, so they can make those informed decisions. Takes it much less away from the sort of heat maps that they're used to, or having to get people feeling that they need to understand the detail of the individual technical controls. So that's something that we're seeing a lot more now in terms of being able to do a translation through from a board who may be a bit intimidated by the technical subject area, who maybe haven't quite understood the nature of the volume cyber threat, and therefore putting the empirical evidence around actual probability of being breached depending on what connections they have in their systems and what the impact of that could be around business interruption costs, really allows them to start to see what the true scale of the issue might be for their organisations. And for some, actually, they might look at it and go, okay, our expected loss over the next year might only be 2 to 5% of our annual revenue, and therefore that's within risk tolerance. We don't need to do anything else. We can actually move forward on that basis. But at least at that point, it's then an informed decision as opposed to assumption. Equally, we've had other clients where doing this sort of work, they will look at it and realise that although their IT teams, their outsourced IT providers, were very good in certain areas, they hadn't had that holistic lens on it, and that there were little corners of their estate that may have been forgotten about or may have been spun up a bit too rapidly, which actually are the areas that could cause them real concern, but also are the areas that could be quickly, much more rapidly and cost effectively to start to reduce that risk. So there are definitely some areas here where we find trying to translate that sort of board approach allows us to have much more informed decisions, whereas before with a lot of the traditional approaches, we had gone along, talked to boards about it, talked about the risk, but they still couldn't really understand that quantification. So what we hope over the next 2 or 3 years, there is a potential movement in America to start to make this kind of quantification mandatory for regulated firms. But it is something that we think boards will hopefully take more and more seriously and allow us to have more of those conversations. So I will stop talking now, because I think it's time for questions. Unfortunately, I had to join via a Zoom link, as opposed to via Pathable, but there were 2 poll questions I was quite interested to get feedback from the audience, just to see if the organisations you represent, whether your boards do meet and review cyber risk regularly, and whether you think a sort of quantification approach like this might be a good way to get the attention of those boards on and thinking about it as you move forward. Mark, can you, I don't know if anyone's had a chance to respond to those polls, but I don't think I can see them on the current screen.
Yeah. So for our audience, if you do head to the polls section, you'll see the questions that are in there that James has put in, which is, does your board regularly review cyber risks? And the second question, do you think your board would pay more attention to cyber risks if they were objectively quantified in terms of potential loss? So feel free to go ahead and just click the vote buttons against those questions if you'd like to give us your own feedback from the audience. In the meantime, however, James, there's 1 or 2 questions that have come in from the audience that I can put through to you, and then we'll have a look at the results afterwards. First question, how do I encourage a proactive response from the board in progressing cyber insurance and security without having to have a breach first?
So funny, not trying to make all my answers come back to risk quantification. Funny enough, we're talking to a couple of organisations at the minute who wanted to go through that quantification first, so they could go to a board and say, did you know that our losses next year could be in the order of X, and have that underpinned by a model. In fact, I've got a client who I'm running through exercise with tomorrow, who it shouldn't start from this way, but it actually did start from this way, going, we've been looking at cyber insurance, we don't know whether we need to get it or what level of cover we should get it. Could you help quantify some of that? So I think if a board's looking at that, I think turning it into in that financial view has been the most effective approach that we've found over the last year.
Yeah, and I suppose that speaks to the next question that came through, which is, I guess, a variation on this, is what's the best way to hammer home the importance of cyber risks to board members? So do you primarily see that sort of financial review is normally the best approach to help explain to the board what the possible impact could be of doing nothing or maybe standing still with cybersecurity?
Yeah, so it tends to be, the worst case for them is they've had a breach. So no, but the second worst case is that somebody on the board knows somebody in another organisation that's had a breach. That tends to hammer it home. Otherwise, I think it's quite incumbent when you're talking to a board, understanding their what area they operate in and what the type of company is, because there's no point talking to a mid-market manufacturer about the Marriott or the PA fines, because they'll just look and go, well, they're big, of course they're going to be targeted. So we had always built up a bit of a set of case studies to try, and if we're talking to an individual company, bring to life examples from their industry to try and bring to life the fact that anybody could be targeted. But again, that was something that people would normally pay attention to in the session, but go away, and there'd always be that hope, well, it probably still won't be us. So yeah, come back to that quantification point. That's where we've had the best success.
And I guess, again, another sort of related question is, do you believe that utilizing reports on vulnerabilities and business risk and exploiting that technique is a good way to convince the board to invest? I suppose really that sort of comes down to, again, what's the best way to present the information? Is that you can present the financial information, but
Yeah.
do we also need to be focused on, vulnerability reports? Is there a danger, I guess, that can get too technical and can switch people off, or does that approach to support the risk analysis of saying, look, this is what we're talking about and this is the risk? Do they go hand in hand, or is it primarily the focus on the risk?
So it's interesting because when you come in and doing sort of short, sharp, what's the state of the nation? Some people have glaring holes, and that can be a real call to action. Some people you can go in and you can do the vulnerability scans and everything else, and actually, there's a few out-of-date bits of software that have no exploits available for them. So people look and go, well, actually, we still feel okay. And vulnerability management is an interesting one, especially on an ongoing basis, because you have to work hard with the board to get them to understand you may close down 60% of your vulnerabilities in a certain cycle, but because of the nature of it, there might be another 70% of new vulnerabilities that have appeared. So I've worked with a number of boards where they almost get a little bit depressed 2 months into a vulnerability management cycle, because yes, you fixed the load, but you still have more vulnerabilities than you started with. And again, there it is getting people, I think, to understand that these things are cyclical and need ongoing maintenance. It's not just building the wall and then leaving the wall. It's making sure there is that ongoing attention to it, but that can be quite hard to articulate to somebody. You've done a really good job, but the state of the nation is a whole load of new stuff's come up that you have to do a really good job on again.
Job of cybersecurity is never done. Yeah. We've had some votes come in on the polls. I'm not sure how many people have voted, but so far, does your board regularly review cyber risks? We've got 70-30 saying yes, which I suppose is good to hear. That's quite a high number. Do you think your board would pay more attention to cyber risks if they were objectively quantified in terms of potential loss? 75% yes, 13% no, and 13% NA. Well, I guess is our don't know option there. So those are the results that we've had through from our audience. So thank you very much for everybody for taking part in that, and also for your questions. Thank you so much, James, for the insightful presentation, and to the audience for being engaged. If you have further questions, you can use the people section at the top of the screen in the event portal to contact James, or indeed any of our speakers. It's time to wrap up this session, but we're keeping up the pace around here with the next 2 agenda items due to start in 5 minutes. Head back to the agenda screen. We've got a presentation and a panel discussion for you to choose from. But in the meantime, once again, thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.